On a Tuesday morning in Coldwater County, a 9-year-old German shepherd named Echo was tied to a metal pole outside the county shelter, and a man in a pale blue uniform was walking toward him with a long-barreled syringe in his hand. The dog did not pull. The dog did not whine. Echo lowered his gray muzzle to the cracked pavement and waited, because this old animal had learned a long time ago that fighting did not always change the ending. In the parking lot, 4 people watched in silence. One of them was a thin woman in a green apron who had cried on the drive over. One of them was a teenage boy in a faded rodeo shirt who had driven his pickup in from the back of his family's property. One of them was a veterinarian named Dr. Patel who had spent 2 days trying to find another way. And one of them was a quiet stranger in a plain leather jacket who had just stepped out of a black truck with Tennessee plates. None of them had spoken. None of them knew that the stranger had driven through the night to be standing in this exact gravel lot at this exact minute. The syringe was almost at the dog's ear when the stranger stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He said the dog's name, and the dog lifted his head. What happens next would cost the stranger everything he had built since the day he had come home from war. The dog's name was Echo, and he had lived longer than most German shepherds ever get to live. He had been born in a cold barn on the Callaway Ranch in the spring of a hard year, the year the wells had run low and the cotton had failed. Hollis Callaway had been a young man then, not yet the gray, slow-moving grandfather that the neighbors knew today. He had held the pup in one hand and checked the soft pink of the pup's gums the way his own father had taught him, and he had decided, right there in the straw, that this one would stay. The pup had grown into the kind of dog that ranchers talked about over coffee. He moved with the herd before the herd moved. He barked once at strangers and then fell silent at the sound of Hollis's voice. He did not bite people. He bit a man once, and the man had been swinging a wrench at Hollis's fence post, and the man had bled from his hand, and the man had run to the truck that day swearing that he would see Echo destroyed for it. That man was a county man now. His name was Drennan Maddox. He ran the Coldwater County Animal Shelter. He had wanted Echo dead for 4 years, and on this Tuesday morning he was about to get his wish. Hollis Callaway was 74 years old, and his heart had begun to fail in the way that old hearts fail slowly. He tired by noon. He could not lift the salt blocks anymore. He still drove his old blue truck down to the cattle gate every morning, but the drive took him longer now, and he pulled over twice on the gravel roads to catch his breath. He had raised Echo from a pup. He had promised the dog, on the night his grandson had shipped out for the Navy, that the dog would never be without him. Hollis had kept that promise for 9 years. But 2 weeks earlier, he had woken in the night unable to draw a full breath, and his daughter had driven him to the VA hospital in Lubbock, and a kind doctor with kind eyes had told the family what was coming. Hollis had come home on a Wednesday with a new bottle of pills and a quiet understanding that the promise he had made to Echo was about to become impossible to keep. He had called his grandson on a Thursday. The call had lasted 11 seconds. The grandson had not asked a single question. He had said only one thing back. The grandson's name was Beckett Callaway, but everyone who had ever served with him knew him only as Beck. He was 33 years old. He had been a Navy SEAL for almost 9. He had 2 combat deployments behind him, a shoulder that clicked when it rained, and a small apartment in Virginia Beach that he had not seen in 7 months. He was exhausted the way that only men who have carried too many quiet things for too long can be exhausted. He had not slept in his own bed in a year. He had stopped looking at his phone except when it rang. When his grandfather's number came up on a Thursday evening, Beck was 3,000 miles away, sitting on a curb outside a gym that had just closed. He answered before the second ring. His grandfather said only one sentence. He said that the dog needed him. Beck said only one thing back. He said that he was on his way. He packed a single bag. He drove to the airport. He changed into dry clothes in a men's room in Atlanta. He rented a black truck in Lubbock. He drove west through the dark toward Coldwater County. He arrived at the gravel lot outside the county shelter at 6 in the morning, the same minute that the man with the syringe was climbing out of a gray sedan. The shelter sat on a flat stretch of gravel 2 miles north of the Callaway Ranch. It was not a large building. It was the kind of place that smelled the way all small shelters smell when the wind comes in the wrong direction. The sign out front read Coldwater County Animal Services, and the letters had begun to fade. Inside, there were 11 wire cages. 2 dogs sat hunched in the back. A tabby cat slept on a folded towel on the desk. Drennan Maddox ran the place with a kind of pleasant cruelty. He smiled when he talked to families. He called the dogs sweet names when reporters came by. Behind the building, in a low cinder block room that no cameras ever saw, There were things that the families of Coldwater County did not know about, and would not have believed if they had been told. Drennan Maddox had built his small kingdom on something ugly. He had built it on dogs that disappeared in the night, and on numbers written into ledgers that did not match the truth, and on a quiet deal with the sheriff of Coldwater County that let him do as he pleased beneath the law. Sheriff Roy Tyndall was 58 years old. He had been elected 3 times. He drove a tan cruiser with a single spotlight on the roof. He had a soft voice on the radio and a hard handshake in person. He had known Drennan Maddox since they were both teenagers working summers at the feed store. He had believed for a long time that Drennan was a good man. He had stopped believing that 2 years earlier, on the night his own daughter had come home with a missing patch of skin on the back of her hand and a story about Drennan's back room. Roy Tyndall had not done anything about it. He had not arrested Drennan. He had not reported Drennan. He had not even called the state investigators whose card sat in his desk drawer. He had driven home. He had eaten a plate of beans at his kitchen counter. He had watched the local news with the sound turned down. He had decided, because it was easier, that what his daughter had told him was something he had imagined. And from that night forward, he had looked the other way every single time, because looking the other way was the only thing that let Roy Tyndall keep his badge, his county, and his quiet mornings without a single problem weighing on his conscience. He knew what was going to happen at 6 o'clock that morning. He had driven past the shelter twice already. He had told himself that the paperwork was in order, and the paperwork was, in fact, in order, because Drennan Maddox had spent 4 years making sure that the paperwork was always in order. Echo had done nothing wrong. That was what made the morning cruel. Echo had been on the Callaway Ranch, sleeping at the foot of the swing on the porch, when a man named Briggs had walked onto the property in the night with a pair of wire cutters and a flashlight. Briggs worked for a landowner on the next range. He had come, he would later admit under oath, because Drennan Maddox had paid him to come. Briggs had cut a wire on the back fence. He had let 5 head of cattle drift onto the Callaway land, and he had planned to come back in the morning and claim that the cattle had broken out on their own, and that Hollies owed him compensation for the lost grays. The plan was simple. The plan did not account for Echo. Echo had woken at the sound of the wire. He had crossed the yard in 3 strides. He had found Briggs in the dark. He had barked once, and he had pressed his body against the fence in front of Briggs, and Briggs had dropped his cutters and started to back away. Briggs had not been bitten. Briggs had cut his own hand on the wire as he climbed back over. Briggs had gone to Drennan. Drennan had written a report that said Echo had attacked a man. Drennan had filed the report with the county clerk on the day that Hollies had been hospitalized in Lubbock. Drennan had watched the case move through the system with the patient smile of a man who knew how the system worked. By the time Hollies came home, there was a destruction order sitting on his kitchen table, stamped and signed by the county judge, and a phone number he could call to schedule the appointment. Dr. Anya Patel had been the county's only veterinarian for 9 years. She had a small clinic on Main Street with a wooden Indian out front and a glass jar of dog biscuits on the counter. She had treated Echo for everything Echo had ever caught, from a thorn in the pad to the arthritis that had begun to stiffen his back legs. She had written 2 letters to the county judge asking the court to reconsider. She had offered to take Echo into her own home. She had offered to drive Echo herself to a sanctuary 2 counties north. She had called the state association 3 times. She had called the university vet school once. None of it mattered because Drennan Maddox had made sure that none of it mattered. He had not threatened Dr. Patel. He had only smiled at her across the parking lot one afternoon and said that he hoped her clinic stayed busy. Dr. Patel had understood. She had cried in her office for an hour that afternoon. She had driven to the shelter on Tuesday morning because she had promised Echo that she would be there, even though being there meant watching. The woman in the green apron was Dovie Renteria. She had worked at the Callaway Ranch for 16 years. She had fed Echo every morning. She had given Echo the nickname Bug because the dog had been born with one bent ear that flopped sideways. She had been the one who had called the sheriff when the destruction order came. She had been the one who had been ignored. She had driven in from the ranch on Tuesday morning because she could not bear the thought of Echo dying without a familiar hand on his neck. The teenage boy in the faded rodeo shirt was her nephew, Marek. He was 18. He had known the Callaway Ranch since he could walk. He had been in the truck with his aunt that morning because he had wanted to be the one to drive Echo home if a miracle happened. He had not believed in miracles for a few years by then. He had brought one anyway. And the quiet stranger in the leather jacket was Beck Callaway, and he had been awake for almost 30 hours, and his hands were shaking slightly from the coffee he had stopped drinking, and he had come 3,000 miles to stand in this exact gravel lot because a man 74 years old had spoken 11 seconds of truth into a telephone. Beck had grown up on the Callaway Ranch. He had been 5 years old the morning his mother had put him on a hay bale and told him that the new pup was his to name. He had sat on the hay bale for a full minute with his hands on the pup's back, and the pup had put its gray muzzle right into Beck's hand, and Beck had looked up at his grandfather and said the name Echo because the pup looked like a sound that you throw into a canyon. Hollies had laughed. He had picked Beck up. He had carried both boy and pup to the porch. That was the first memory Beck had of anything that mattered, and he had carried it with him through 3 oceans and 4 deployments, and one night outside a city he could not name in which he had decided that America had been worth every step he had ever walked for her. Beck had come home the first time at 26. He had carried Echo around the yard for a full minute without putting him down. He had wept against the dog's neck. He had promised Echo the same promise he had made every time, that he would never leave the dog alone. He had shipped out again 5 months later, and he had broken that promise the only way a soldier ever breaks a promise, by being sent somewhere he could not describe. When Beck had shipped out the 3rd time, Echo had stopped eating for 2 days. Hollies had sat beside the dog in the kitchen night after night, hand on the dog's neck, telling the dog stories about the boy he had raised, until Echo had finally lifted his head and eaten a small piece of bread from Hollies' hand. From that night forward, Echo had slept at the foot of Hollies' chair, and his ears had lifted at the sound of any truck on the gravel road. Beck walked into the lot on a Tuesday morning at 6:04. He had not slept. He had driven across 3 states without a real stop. He had been thinking about a different Tuesday, 12 years earlier, when he had been 21 and home on leave, and he had taken Echo out into the pasture for what he had meant to be a quick walk. They had been gone 4 hours. He had been a different man then, even younger, even softer, a boy trying to figure out if he was brave enough to do what his recruiter had asked. The dog had walked beside him through the mesquite, and Beck had told the dog things he had not told anyone else, and the dog had listened with the stillness that only good dogs have. Beck had decided that morning, somewhere on a gravel road in Coldwater County, that he was going to be a SEAL. He had told the dog first. Echo had lifted his head. Echo had pressed his nose into Beck's palm. That was the conversation they had had. It was still the only one that mattered. Beck parked the black truck at the edge of the lot. He did not get out for almost a minute. He sat with his hands on the wheel and looked through the windshield at Echo tied to the post. The dog was thinner than he should have been. His back legs were stiff. His muzzle was almost fully gray. He was not the dog Beck had carried around the yard 7 years earlier. And he was the same dog, exactly the same dog, in every way that mattered to a man who had once carried him around the yard on a Tuesday in another life. A man in a pale blue uniform was walking across the gravel toward Echo with a long-barreled syringe. There was a small couch inside the shelter door. There was a clipboard on a folding table. There was no veterinarian in the room. There was no judge. There was only Drennan Maddox and the quiet of a man who believed that nothing in this lot had the power to stop him. Beck stepped out of the truck. He did not slam the door. He closed it the way a man closes a door when he does. Not want the room to focus on him yet. He walked across the gravel with the kind of slow walk that veterans learn. He crossed his arms behind his back. He kept his hands visible. He kept his eyes on Echo, and Echo lifted his head, and the dog's tail, which had been still for hours, moved once, just once, slowly. The way a dog moves his tail when the person who has been missing for years finally stands in front of him. Drennan Maddox saw Beck come across the lot. He did not recognize Beck. He saw only a thin man in a leather jacket with dark circles under his eyes. He did not slow his walk. He had been told that the order was signed. He had been told that no one would be there to stop him. He had been told that even the sheriff had agreed. Beck spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He said the dog's name. He said the second word slowly. He said that this dog was not going to be destroyed here. He did not say it the way a person makes a threat. He said it the way a person makes a statement, the way a person states the temperature outside, the way a person tells the room that the chair he is sitting in is a chair and not a throne. Drennan Maddox did not hear it that way. Drennan Maddox heard it as a young man challenging him on a piece of ground he owned. Drennan Maddox slowed his walk one step. He looked at Beck. He said something back about the order, about the law, about the documents that were signed in his hand. Beck did not answer that. Beck asked one question. He asked whether Drennan had read the order himself, or whether he had been told what the order said. He asked it in a voice that was not louder than a normal voice. He asked it the way a man asks a question when he already knows the answer, and he is giving the room one chance to step back from what is about to happen. Dovie Renteria had climbed out of her truck by then. She was standing 15 feet to the left, hand on the fence. Marek was at the wheel, engine off, window down. Dr. Patel was at the corner of the building, hands in the pockets of her white coat. They watched. They did not speak. They had been watching Drennan walk toward Echo for 4 minutes, and they had been afraid, and their fear loosened when this quiet stranger arrived, because there was something about the way he crossed the gravel that made the air cooler. Drennan Maddox lifted the syringe. He said something else that did not deserve to be repeated. He said that the dog was a danger, that the dog had bitten a man, that the dog had no future and no right, and that anyone who stood between a man with a court order and the thing the order had been written for was going to walk out of this lot in handcuffs. Beck did not move. He did not step back. He did not step forward. He did exactly what a SEAL learns in his first year of training, which is to slow the moment down so that the moment belongs to him. He uncrossed his arms. He put one hand at his side. He looked at the gravel for half a second. He lifted his eyes to Drennan. He said that there was a federal question about whether this dog had ever bitten anyone in the first place, and that the question was going to be answered before the syringe was ever used. He said it without anger. He said it the way a man lays a brick. Echo was still watching Beck. The dog's eyes had not left Beck since the moment Beck had stepped out of the truck. Echo did not strain at the rope. Echo did not whine. Echo had learned in his old age that pulling at the rope never changed what the rope had been tied to. He waited. He let the seconds pass. He let the man he had known since he was a pup handle the room. What had really happened on the night that the destruction order had been written was something none of them knew yet, except for Beck, who had spent the last 4 hours of his drive pulling every thread he could reach. He had phoned an old friend from SEAL Team 3 who was now a deputy at the Department of Justice. He had phoned his sister's husband, who was a district attorney in another state. He had phoned a woman at the U.S. Attorney's office who had once written him a legal review note on an unrelated case. He had not raised his voice to any of them. He had written the facts down on a legal pad he had bought at a Walmart in Ada, Oklahoma. He had read them aloud in 3 phone calls. He had asked one question at the end of each call. He had asked whether anything about the facts he had just laid out looked like the kind of facts a federal prosecutor would want to see. All 3 of them had said yes. The third one had said it the fastest. She had said it before Beck had even finished the sentence. She had said that she would have a person assigned to Coldwater County by Wednesday morning if Beck would agree to keep his grandfather's dog alive until then. Beck had agreed before he had even parked the truck. What Beck had laid out on that legal pad was not just an animal cruelty complaint. It was a 4-year pattern. It was dogfights held behind the shelter twice a year, in a cinderblock room that no cameras could ever see. It was a list of 17 specific animals that had been reported as missing by families in the county, and that had never been located. It was a payment ledger that had surfaced 3 weeks earlier in a civil suit brought by a former employee. It was a sheriff's signature on a series of reports that should never have been signed by anyone. It was a judge who had been paid in cash, and a clerk who had been threatened, and a quiet deal at the county courthouse that had been running since the year Beck had first shipped out. It was the kind of pattern that gets a small federal prosecutor very excited on a Tuesday afternoon, especially when a Navy SEAL is the one laying the bricks. Drennan Maddox did not know any of this yet. Drennan Maddox believed that he was still the most powerful man in Coldwater County because Drennan Maddox had been the most powerful man in Coldwater County for almost 20 years. He had grown up there. He had married there. He had bought the building with cash he never explained. He had buried 3 dogs on the back lot with the help of 2 teenagers who had agreed after the third one that they were not coming back. Drennan Maddox looked at Beck and saw only a tired stranger. He did not see what the stranger had been. He did not see the training. He did not see the deployments. He did not see the 30 hours without sleep and the 11-second phone call. Drennan Maddox lifted the syringe 1 more inch. Beck did something else then. He did not move toward Drennan. He moved toward Echo. He crossed the 10 feet between them in 4 steps. He did not kneel. He lowered himself slowly, the way a man lowers himself when his back has been injured. He put one hand on Echo's neck. Echo lifted his muzzle into Beck's palm. Beck closed his eyes for half a second. He opened them. He said to Drennan, without looking up, that this dog was his grandfather's dog, that this dog had never bitten anyone, and that if the syringe touched the dog, the man holding it was going to answer for it in front of a federal judge within a week. Drennan Maddox did not lower the syringe. Drennan Maddox called Sheriff Roy Tyndall on his radio. He told the sheriff that there was a man at the shelter interfering with a court order. He asked the sheriff to come down. He said it like a man who had called that number 100 times before for 100 different reasons, and who had never once been told no. Sheriff Roy Tyndall was sitting in his cruiser 2 miles down the gravel road. He had been sitting there for 20 minutes. He had been thinking about his daughter. He had been thinking about a phone call he had received at 2 in the morning 2 nights earlier from a former federal agent in Lubbock whose name he had not yet entered into his phone, and who had asked Sheriff Tyndall, in a very calm voice, whether Sheriff Tyndall would like to be a witness or a defendant in a case that was being opened that morning. Sheriff Tyndall had not slept that night either. He had sat at his kitchen table and read the same paragraph 3 times. He had realized that the cards in his desk drawer had been left there for exactly this morning. He had realized that the woman he had married 40 years earlier had been right about him more often than she had been wrong. He had realized that the life he had been living on the right side of a thin line was about to be the thing that decided whether he was the man he had always said he was, or the man Drennan Maddox had quietly made him into. He had decided, somewhere in the second hour of that long night, that he was going to drive to the shelter that morning and do the thing he had been afraid of doing for 2 years. He had not known about Beck. He had only known that the federal agent had asked him to be there. Sheriff Roy Tyndall turned his cruiser around on the gravel road. He turned his lights on. He drove the 2 miles in the opposite direction of what Drennan Maddox had expected him to drive. He pulled into the lot at 6:12. He stepped out of the cruiser. He did not put on his hat. He did not reach for his belt. He walked across the gravel to where Beck was kneeling beside Echo. He looked at Drennan. He said the words that Drennan had never heard him say in 20 years of friendship. He said that the order was being held, that the syringe was to be put down, and that Drennan Maddox was going to sit in the back of the cruiser until further notice. Drennan Maddox did not move for several seconds. He looked at Sheriff Tyndall as if the sheriff had started speaking a different language. He said that the order was signed. He said that the paperwork was in his hand. He said that the sheriff had agreed. He said all of this in a voice that was louder than Beck had been, because Drennan Maddox had spent a long time believing that loudness was the same thing as authority. Already, Sheriff Tyndall did not raise his voice back. He said in a calm tone that the order was a piece of paper, and that pieces of paper had been known to lie. He said that there was a federal matter being opened. He said that the federal matter would take precedence, and that any man who interfered with the federal matter was going to be arrested. He said it the way a person says something that has been true for a long time but has only just now been said. Beck was still kneeling beside Echo. Echo had not moved either. Echo had pressed his muzzle against Beck's hand, and he had stayed there because Echo had known, in the way that good dogs know, that the man he had been waiting for had finally come for him. Beck did not look up at the sheriff. Beck said quietly, without anger, that the dog was going to go home in his truck. He said that the dog was going to sleep in the yard beside his grandfather's chair. He said that the dog had never bitten anyone, and that the men who said the dog had bitten anyone were going to have to explain themselves to someone who was going to ask them harder questions than they had ever been asked. Drennan Maddox looked at the syringe in his hand. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at Beck. He looked at the 4 people who were watching him from the corners of the lot. He realized, somewhere in the middle of all that looking, that the morning had stopped being his. He put the syringe down on the gravel. He said one more thing that did not deserve to be repeated. He said it loud enough to be sure the dog could hear it. Then he walked to the cruiser and sat in the back seat. Sheriff Tyndall closed the door. Sheriff Tyndall walked back to his own door. He did not put his hat on yet. He stood at the open door for half a minute looking out across the lot. Then he put his hat on. He drove Drennan Maddox to the courthouse. Beck did not stand up right away. He stayed beside Echo. He put both hands on the dog's neck. He leaned his forehead against the dog's gray muzzle. He stayed like that for a long time. He had not cried since the morning his grandfather had first put him on a hay bale. He cried now. He cried quietly. He cried the way a man cries when he has been holding something for a long time and he has finally been given a moment to put it down. Echo pressed his muzzle closer. Echo's tail moved once more, slowly. Dovie Renteria crossed the gravel then. She did not say anything at first. She put one hand on Beck's shoulder. She put the other hand on Echo's neck. She cried too. Marek walked over from the truck. He lifted the rope from the pole with the kind of careful movement that a person uses around something that has been waiting for a long time. Dr. Patel walked over last. She knelt on the other side of Echo. She put her stethoscope to the dog's chest. She listened for a long time. She looked up at Beck. She said that the dog's heart was strong and that the dog had years left, and that the man on the porch was going to get to see them. Beck stood up. He lifted Echo into the back of his truck the way his grandfather had once lifted him into the porch swing. Echo did not weigh what he had weighed 7 years earlier. Echo weighed, instead, the weight of every promise that anyone in that family had ever made to him. Beck put a soft blanket from his bag under the dog. He climbed into the cab. He started the engine. He drove the 2 miles down the gravel road toward the Callaway Ranch without turning on the radio, because the morning was the kind of morning that does not need more sound in it. Holly's Callaway was sitting on the porch when the truck pulled up. He was wrapped in a wool blanket. His daughter was beside him. His granddaughter was on the steps. Holly's sister, who had flown in that morning from Albuquerque, was pouring a cup of coffee that no one was ready to drink. They all looked up when the truck drove in. They watched Beck step out. They watched Beck walk around to the back of the truck. They watched Beck lift Echo down the way you lift down something you have been missing. Echo saw the porch. Echo saw Holly's. Echo's tail moved in a way that was stronger than anything he had done in 2 months. Echo pulled toward the steps. Beck set him down. Echo climbed the 3 wooden steps slowly, one paw at a time, the way old dogs climb steps when their hips are tired. He crossed the porch. He pressed his muzzle against Holly's knee. Holly's put a hand down. He put the hand on Echo's head. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The family sat on the porch together for a long time that morning. Dr. Patel came up the road an hour later with a paper bag of medicine and a list of instructions she had printed on the back of a feed store receipt. Merrick sat on the bottom step and kept his hand on Echo's back, because Merrick had once been the boy who had driven a pickup to a gravel lot to bring a dog home, and he had wanted to keep doing that even after the dog was home. Dovie sat on the swing with her hands in her lap. Beck sat in the chair his grandfather had always used. He sat in it even though it was not his chair, because he had been away for 7 months and his grandfather had asked him to come home, and home was where the chair was. They did not know, sitting on that porch, that the morning was not yet over. They did not know that 3 federal agents were driving west on the highway at that same minute, and that a state investigator was driving north from Lubbock, and that a district attorney's husband was on a flight to a city 200 miles east. They did not know that within 72 hours, the sheriff would walk into the courthouse with a brown folder of evidence that he had been keeping in the bottom of his closet for 2 years. They did not know that within a week, the county judge who had signed the destruction order would resign. They did not know that within 10 days, the cinderblock room behind the shelter would be opened by men in soft jackets who carried cameras. They did not know on that warm Tuesday morning that the 4-year pattern that Beck had laid out on a legal pad in a Walmart in Oklahoma was about to become the biggest federal case that Coldwater County had ever seen. They only knew that Echo was home, that Holly's was sitting up straighter than he had in 2 weeks, that Dovie's nephew was gently stroking the dog's back, and that the morning had become the kind of morning that a family remembers for the rest of their lives. The porch was quiet. The coffee cooled. The wind came in slow. Echo's tail slowed too, and his eyes closed, and he settled his head on his paws at the foot of Holly's chair, in the same spot he had chosen every morning for 9 years, in the exact spot he had been meant to return to. A week later, the courthouse in the next town over held a hearing. Most hearings in small Texas counties draw 3 or 4 family members in the gallery. This one drew 111. They sat in the wooden pews in their Sunday clothes, and they watched the man they had known since they were children be led in front of the bench in handcuffs. The federal agents had done their work. The patterns had been confirmed. The ledgers had matched. The dogs that had been reported missing had been accounted for. The judge was a different judge, one who had been assigned from a neighboring county by the Chief Justice. The new judge looked down at Drennan Maddox and said, in a calm voice, that the law had been broken many times over and that the men who were going to answer for it had run out of room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said it the same way Beck had said it on the gravel that morning, the way a fact is said when the time has come to say it. Drennan Maddox, who had smiled through every interview he had ever given, who had shaken hands with every family he had ever told the truth to, who had been a familiar face at every church supper for 20 years, looked across the gallery as he was led out. He saw the faces of people he had known his whole life. He saw, for the first time in a long time, that he was not what he had always believed he was. He sat in the back of the marshal's car with his head down. He did not speak to the marshals. He did not tell them that his kingdom had fallen. They had seen it fall. He had seen it fall. There was nothing left to say. The sheriff of Coldwater County was sentenced to a federal restitution program and 300 hours of community service at a shelter for abused animals in another state. He accepted the sentence without a statement. He did not look at his wife when the sentence was read. He drove home alone. He sat at his kitchen counter that night and stared at the wall for an hour. Then he pulled out the cards he had been keeping in his desk drawer. He picked up the phone. He asked the federal agent if there was anything else he could do. He was told that there was. He was told that the first thing he could do was to walk into the Callaway Ranch that weekend and apologize to a man who had been too tired to come into town and speak for himself. He did it on a Saturday. He stood on the Callaway porch. He asked Hollies to forgive him. Hollies looked at him for a long time. Then Hollies said that forgiveness was a thing he had been working on and that the sheriff could come back in a year if he was still the man he had decided to become. Sheriff Tyndall nodded. He left a small bag of dog treats on the porch step. He climbed back into his cruiser. He did not turn on his lights. He drove the long way home. 2 months passed on the Callaway Ranch. Holly's heart had not improved, but his appetite had. He was eating again. He was sitting up on the porch for an hour every afternoon. Echo slept at the foot of his chair in the morning, walked beside his truck when Hollies drove down to the cattle gate in the afternoon, and slept at the foot of Hollies' bed at night. CK had extended his leave. He had stayed longer than the Navy had asked him to stay. He had not yet decided what he was going to do when the leave ended, and he had stopped trying to decide. Because morning after morning he sat on the porch with his grandfather and watched the dog he had carried around the yard at age 5 lie down beside the man who had carried Beck around the yard at age 5. And he began to think that some things did not need a decision. Hollies asked him a question one morning. He asked it from the chair. He asked it in a voice that was quiet and slow. He asked whether the boy he had raised had come home to stay. Beck said he did not know. He said that he had been thinking about it. He said that there was a small piece of land on the south end of the ranch that had not been worked in a long time. He said that he had been thinking about putting up a fence on that piece of land and rebuilding a barn. He said that he had been thinking that the barn did not need to be very big. He said that it would only need to be big enough for one dog and one more chair. Hollies smiled. He had not smiled that wide in a year. He said that the chair could be built from the same wood as the barn. He said that Echo would like that. He said that Echo had always liked to sleep near the sound of a hammer. The story of that Tuesday morning spread through Coldwater County the way that all true stories spread through small towns. It was told at the feed store, and at the church supper, and at the gas station on the highway, and at the post office on Wednesday mornings. It was told with the slow care of people who had waited a long time to be told a good story, and who wanted to tell it without losing any of the small pieces. People who had known Drennan Maddox for decades said that they had suspected something and had been too afraid to say it. People who had known Roy Tyndall said that they had been proud of the man for once doing the right thing. People who had not known what had been happening behind the shelter said that they had cried when they had been told about the room and the dogs that had been taken there in the night. People who had known Echo said that they had always known that the dog had been the kind of dog that does not come along very often. Dovie Renteria said, in the voice of a woman who had been crying for 4 years and was finally able to stop, that Echo was the best thing that had ever happened to the Callaway Ranch, and that the family had been right to bring him home. Merrick said, in the voice of an 18-year-old who had begun to believe in things again, that he had driven the truck to the shelter that morning because he had wanted to do one thing right in his life, and that one thing right had turned out to be enough. Dr. Patel said, in the voice of a woman who had been writing letters for 2 days that no one had read, that she was going to put a plaque on the front of her clinic with Echo's name on it, and that the plaque would not say anything about the destruction order or the cold morning or the man with the syringe. The plaque would say only that this dog had been loved. There is one more thing to tell, and then the story lets go. On a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, with the wind coming in slow across the mesquite, Beck Callaway sat in a wooden chair on the new porch of a small barn at the south end of the Callaway Ranch. The chair had been built from the same wood as the barn. The chair sat in the corner where the light came in cleanest. Beside the chair, on a woven rug that Dovie had brought over from her own porch, Echo lay with his head on his paws and his gray muzzle pointed toward the open door. Behind him, in the larger house up the hill, Hollies Callaway was sitting in his usual chair. He was eating a slice of bread. He was watching the road. He was waiting for his grandson to come up the hill with the dog for the evening walk. Up the hill, the setters on the front porch were ringing in the wind, and the cattle were quiet in the far pasture, and the light on the grass looked the way it had looked when Beck was 5, and when the dog was a pup, And when a man 74 years old had walked out to the porch and said to himself that this was the day a promise was going to be kept. Beck did not move from the chair for a long time. He sat with one hand resting on Echo's back. Echo breathed slowly. The wind moved the dust across the porch. The dust settled. The light held. Nothing else needed to happen that afternoon for the morning to be complete, or for the promise to be honored, or for the family to feel that the worst thing that had been about to happen had been stopped by a man who had simply decided that it could not happen, and that the decision was enough. The story lets go now the way stories let go when they have done what they were written to do. Echo sleeps at the foot of the chair. Holly's is sitting up again. The ranch is quiet. The wind is moving softly. Through the mesquite. Somewhere down the gravel road, there is a courthouse that has a new judge and a sheriff who is doing the kind of work he should have done 20 years earlier. Somewhere behind a shelter that is being slowly repaired, there is a cinder block room that is being torn down, brick, by men in soft jackets who are taking their time. Somewhere there is a federal agent who is sitting at her desk in Lubbock with a closing memo on her screen and a coffee that has gone cold. Somewhere there is a Walmart legal pad that is sitting in the glove box of a black truck with Tennessee plates, and the writing on the pad is harder to read because of a coffee stain that landed on the page on a long drive through Oklahoma. None of those places need to be visited again. They were visited once. They did their work. They let the rest of the story become the rest of the story. What is left is the porch. What is left is the chair. What is left is a dog whose tail moves slowly when the man he has loved since he was a pup sits down beside him. What is left is a hand on a neck. What is left is a Sunday afternoon in autumn in Coldwater County, where the wind comes in slow across the mesquite, and a man who once drove through the night to save an old dog sits in a chair his grandfather would have built and breathes, and does not have to speak, because the silence at the foot of the chair says everything that a story like this one is supposed to say. And the listener at the end of the hour can finally set down the heavy weight they did not know they had been carrying and exhale.